Hello, Lou Hamilton here in Audible Elegance, Cincinnati, Ohio. We are located a couple doors north of the Montgomery Inn on Montgomery Road and across the street from Montgomery Cyclery. Today I want to do probably the second saddest event I've had in the history of Audible Elegance. The first one being the death of Gary Warzen, who was the head of audiophile systems, a tremendous man who really helped establish who I am and why I do the things I do, and perspective. And but in the early days, going back to our foundation in 1985, two of the earliest lines that we acquired was Lynn and Naim. Now, each of these companies was headed by a very fascinating character in their own right. Ivor Tiefenbrun of Lynn and Julian Vereker of Naim, but a powerful combination they were. And Lynn at that time produced turntables and speakers. Julian did the electronics. And this was a happy combination, and at the early stages of our lifetime with Naim Audio, we always coupled Naim with Lynn and never looked outside the box, which was a huge mistake at that time. We really didn't realize what we had in Naim Audio. I'll be sincere about that. Years later, Lynn proceeded to wanting to be a broader, different company, and so they introduced their own series of electronics. And we picked up the Lynn Electronics at that time, and then very quickly afterwards, the conundrum was presented to audiophile systems that you could only serve one master. You either served Lynn or you served Naim Audio. And there was no question that in terms of value to that importer, that Lynn was really the key. So they essentially ceased importing Naim Audio, and Naim Audio was on its own. And with that schism, and that's the only way of describing it, essentially Naim went from, I think at that time, somewhere around 85 dealers who sold both Lynn and Naim to a mere 3. Now, when this schism occurred, we remained very dedicated to great companies. And on the eve of trying to make the decision of what to do with Naim and remaining strictly to Lynn, one night, about 10 o'clock at night, I decided to screw around with Naim and say, okay, can I sell Naim with anything else? Because at the time Lynn came out with its own electronics, it was also changing the crossover networks of their speakers. And Naim really didn't sound all that good with it, which was another reason, if you're going to sell Lynn speakers, that you really needed to use Lynn electronics. So I ventured off into the deep end one night, and I decided to connect Naim Audio with Teal Audio speakers. And the revelation that occurred to me, well, I got goosebumps right now remembering that night, because the result was absolutely spectacular. And many people realized and saw from us from that point forward that our favorite electronics was to use Naim Audio in combination with Teal loudspeakers. And what a performance it was. We had everything in a box speaker, as the panel people would call it, and with Jim's knowledge and ability of driver technology, we were getting electrostatic type speed with this combination. And Jim only made it better years later. And so at that point, one of the people that we were introduced to was Chris West, who now has his, and Chris was actually in the repair center in England. He came to the States and he combined with another lovely young lady, who unfortunately passed of cancer a few years later, to try to reestablish Naim Audio in the United States. Chris now has his own company and he services up in Chicago, which is where Naim Audio was located, to service all of the vintage, people would call it the Olive series of Naim Audio, and he's great at it. If you've got vintage Naim Audio equipment, you really want to talk to Chris West and see what they can do. Unfortunately, they can't do much for CD players because a lot of those transporting mechanisms or lasers are simply not available, and that's just the way it goes. There's not many people who can service 30-year-old, 40-year-old CD players anyway, so it's no shame on Naim about that. And so Naim Audio began to grow from that point forward. We were very happy with Naim Audio. It was a happy world. And one of the things that Naim was at that time was what I would call a traditional approach in sales. And much like I just finished talking about our personally delivering and setting up each Naya turntable from Riga in your home. Naim Audio also had that requirement that if you sold Naim Audio, that's what they wanted you to do. Now, Naim was rather peculiar because they did not believe in the use of RCA connectors. They used DIN connectors. And so, you couldn't go out and start screwing around with cables. And Julian didn't believe that a customer should be involved in getting the best performance out of your equipment that you can get. It was up to the manufacturer to make sure of that. So his DIN cables not only carried signal, but they also carried the power supply because they used independent power supplies to the preamp. They never enclosed it in the preamp. And with the power supply being DC, it did not present any risk or harm to the signal, audio signal being sent down the same cable. Unlike where you have AC, you have the hum fields and everything else. So when you bought Naim equipment, they supplied the DIN cables that went from preamp to power amp or preamp to power supply to power amp. All of that was taken care of. There was no question about the level of performance you would get out of Naim products. And we were very happy about that. We didn't have to experiment. We didn't have to play screw around. We didn't have broken cables either that we had to send back to the manufacturer to get fixed. So it was a perfect world. And at that time, you also used Naim speaker cable because Julian did not believe in the use of coils inside of the amplifier, inductors, to stabilize the amplifier's performance. Instead, they used a twin lead speaker cable design at a minimum of 10 feet that created the inductance you needed to keep the amplifier stable. The beauty of that approach was that there was no performance difference in Naim Audio systems between 10 feet of speaker cable and 40 feet. There was no performance difference whatsoever, which allowed you to keep your equipment from between the speakers, which is what a lot of people have to do to keep that speaker cable short, allowing better sonic performance, and the equipment was closer to you from your listening position. And that's how things were, and we were one of the very few, the three. And Naim Audio has continued to change. The first signs of it really was in the 90s, unfortunately after Julian's death. And that was the introduction of RCA plugs on the electronics. And part of the drive behind that was to make the product more universal to what everyone else was doing. This was particularly true on the CD players, which were outstanding. So that you didn't wind up having having to come up with a DIN connector and then two RCAs at the other end and all of that kind of mess. And some people did it for a while, but it was never comfortable per se. But we lived through that change, you know. I still like Julian's DIN approach all the way, and eventually he had locking collars on it and things like that. And very sophisticated power supplies. It all started out with a high cap, and then you had the super cap, and then it just went on and on. Because Julian was a very big believer in power supplies and what it meant to the performance of a product. And if you look at some of the great products today, what do you know? They're concentrating on the power supplies. So Julian was really on it. Naim Audio was also the first electronics company for history to use toroidal transformers in the electronics. Not only was it lighter, but it produced a smaller hum field and provided as much current as they needed. You'll now find toroidal transformers being used in many electronics. I just opened up a Cambridge CD player, and lo and behold, there's a toroidal transformer. Well, thank you, Julian, because you opened everybody's eyes to the ways of doing things better. And even Bryson went from I-core to toroidals, okay? Everybody joined the party at that point. Now, as these changes occurred, Naim started to increase its dealership base. And then a few years ago, Naim Audio was purchased, merged into Focal under essentially an investment group. And things got a little strange for us because at that point all of Naim was coming out of Canada. And it got a little weird, but we continued to work through it and forward. And as fate would have it, that investment group was essentially replaced by another investment group. And that's where the world began to change. And from our perspective, not for the better. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, the founding concepts of Naim Audio, of which we are a part. We are, in fact, the second longest lived Naim Audio dealer in the United States. And it was my second line of electronics 39 years ago. The only way of describing it is using the words of Lord Tarkin in Star Wars, that the last elements of the old republic are being swept away. And we've reached a point now with Focal Naim. They were not particularly happy about our departure from Focal, that we have spent the last 9 months trying to reestablish our ability to service and order product. We simply do not have access to their website, and we certainly do not have the password where we can place orders. And this has basically kept us from presenting Naim Audio because we can't fulfill orders. Another product line, we've actually had to issue refunds on Naim Audio this year and a little bit of last year to the tune of probably about $60,000. I had to walk away from a 6-digit sale because I feared being able to try to fulfill that order. We had the same problem with Vicoustics now. We've had to start issuing refunds on that. And to make matters even worse, we continued to try to service Naim, and in some cases, product that we hadn't even sold. But what happened was when they changed over their system in last year, December, we had equipment up there that was being serviced by, for our customers. And even though they had our charge card on file, we had to fight like hell for 3 or 4 months just to get customers' units that had been fixed returned to us. So we're really not part of the vision that the new ownership of Naim Audio sees for itself, and it's in conjunction with Vocal speakers. And at this point, with the inability to order, and their whole marketing has changed dramatically. We've gone from you're a specialist and we want you to sell our product and install it and make sure the customer is happy, to basically selling it to smorgasbord mail order houses that are selling the really big equipment mail order. So God knows what performance is coming out of that. Everybody's kind of on their own. And we see that as a dilution of the quality of the presentation and the quality of the customers are going to get in their home. And we've made the decision, since we can't even order it, we're not going to be a party to that anymore. So we are resigning Naim Audio. And at the same time, unfortunately, we're not even going to attempt even servicing equipment that we've sold. And that is a real painful decision on my part. I have to abandon my own customers because I can't guarantee that they're going to get their equipment back, even if I can find a way of getting it in. And that's a decision that they've made. We didn't. We have to live with their decision, and at the same time, best we can, treat our customers fairly. And unfortunately, not being able to service is very unfair. We can't do anything about it. So it's a very painful decision. Naim Audio is the longest lived product in audible elegance at 39 years, founding product. I met Julian Verica. What a wonderful person, very clear in his thoughts and the way he was going to approach it. And I can remember at one show in Chicago when I asked him about doing something on a product to make it workable with what everyone else was doing. His answer was, why should I screw up my product just to compensate for what they're doing wrong? And that was classic Julian. Julian also had a soft heart, and if you can find it, there was quite a eulogy written actually by Ivor, because Ivor and Julian really hated one another at the point of the schism. Ivor really wrote a beautiful eulogy about it. To give you just a laugh for everybody who's a Naim Audio person, Naim was also not without a sense of humor. So at one of the shows, hi-fi shows, I think it was What Hi-Fi or one of the English magazines, they did a show honoring the best products of the year by class. And then they also had the worst product of the year award. And the worst product of the year award went to Lynn for the Kremlin tuner. And of course, nobody from Lynn Audio was at the show. So when the worst product award was announced, Julian stood up and said, on behalf of my dear friend Ivor, I will accept the award for him. To which the entire room burst out into laughter. So Julian was quite a person. He really was. But the company that we grew up with under the old Republic and the company that is now called Naim Audio, they're not the same. So to use the ownership's best words, adieu.